Rain had a way of making the world feel smaller, compressing sounds and thoughts into a kind of suspended hush. I had ducked into the corner of that little cafe more out of habit than necessity. After all, I didn't usually wait out storms in public, but something about the way the city blurred behind the rain-drenched glass made it feel like a refuge. I ordered a black coffee, the steam rising slowly, curling around my fingers, and watched the street, the umbrellas swaying like hesitant dancers. Then I noticed her. She wasn't loud, wasn't someone who demanded attention. She sat slouched against the window, knees pulled to her chest, fingers nervously tapping empty cup. Her hair was damp, streaked across her face, and I could see the tension in her shoulders before I could hear the words that followed. "I've never felt safe with anyone," she whispered. Her voice was soft, almost lost under the rhythm of rain on glass. But there was an edge in it, a vulnerability that made me pause. I didn't approach immediately. There was no urgency to leap in and fill a gap. Instinct told me to let her presence settle, to exist without interference. And yet, I felt the weight of the moment, a subtle pull that demanded acknowledgement. "Now you will," I replied, simply, calmly, without dramatics or pretension. She lifted her eyes slowly. For a brief second, the world outside seemed to fade, leaving just us in that fragile, suspended space. She didn't respond verbally, only blinked, as if testing whether my words held any truth. I didn't smile or move closer, but I offered my steady gaze, letting her know that I was not going anywhere. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. Time felt pliable then. I observed her trying to gather herself, her fingers curling and uncurling in nervous rhythm, small tremors revealing the remnants of old fears. I ordered another coffee, placing it beside her empty cup without a word. No intrusion, just a gesture. She glanced at it, hesitated, then let a faint exhale escape her lips. A quiet surrender. That was all the acknowledgement. Sometimes safety isn't spoken, it's given, quietly, in consistency, in presence that doesn't demand, doesn't question. I stayed there, silent, while the rain persisted, enveloping the cafe in a soft patter. Her eyes drifted to the window again, the storm outside no less violent than the one she carried within. And yet, in that small, unremarkable space, there was a shift, a fragile seed of trust. She hadn't said it aloud, but I could feel it. The first acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, this time it could be different. The storm outside raged on, but between us, there was an unspoken promise. I didn't offer grand gestures or dramatic assurances, just presence. And sometimes I realized that was everything. The next time I saw her wasn't in a moment of crisis or confessional. It was ordinary, mundane, yet somehow weighted with the residue of our previous encounter. I had taken the same cafe seat near the window, my coffee steaming in a cup that felt unusually warm in my hands. She entered quietly, scanning the room as though seeking permission from the air itself to exist. When our eyes met, a flicker of recognition passed, small, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably. She sat a few tables away, fingers wrapped around a cup of tea this time, and I noticed the subtle tension in her posture, shoulders still tight, chin tucked slightly, gaze half hidden. I didn't approach. There was no need. Instead, I let her presence linger in the periphery of my awareness, a quiet acknowledgement that she could exist without the weight of my intrusion pressing down. It was strange how proximity alone could speak volume, how silence could become a bridge rather than a barrier. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I lost track, caught in the rhythm of coffee spoons tapping against porcelain, of rain still pattering against the window outside, softened by the distance. Occasionally, our eyes would meet briefly, a silent exchange that required no words. I saw hesitation, a flicker of curiosity, and the faintest tremor of vulnerability. She was measuring me, assessing whether my presence could be trusted, whether the promise in that first encounter meant anything at all. I remembered the way she had whispered, and I felt a calm responsibility settle into me. I didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to offer grand assurances or dramatic gestures. Just by existing, by being present in that space without expectation, I was offering something rare, constancy, the kind that doesn't push, doesn't demand, doesn't flinch when confronted with silence. Eventually, she shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if finding a more comfortable stance within herself. Our shared silence became less like a gulf and more like a thread, delicate yet binding. I noticed the little things, the way she traced the rim of her cup with her finger, the brief exhalations when she thought no one was watching, the subtle change in her posture as tension began to ease. These were not dramatic revelations, but small indicators that trust, fragile and tentative, was beginning to take root. When she finally looked directly at me and allowed a faint smile, I felt a quiet affirmation. No words were exchanged, but the connection deepened, a soft undercurrent beneath the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon. I stayed, as I had always intended, offering the unspoken promise of reliability, a calm presence that required nothing in return. And in that silent understanding, I sensed the first flicker of something neither of us needed to name just yet, but that both of us quietly recognized. The start of something important. She didn't speak at first. Not in words that would reach me. The quiet between us had become familiar, like a hallway we both knew how to navigate without stumbling. But today, there was a shift, subtle, yet unmistakable, a trembling, a slight falter in the way she held her cup. I recognized the signs, the silent signals of someone carrying burdens they were not yet ready to unload, and I let her take the lead. It's complicated, she said finally, voice almost a whisper, as though the walls themselves might judge her. I didn't respond immediately. I sipped my coffee, feeling its warmth settle into me, waiting. Sometimes the most important thing is not what you say, but the space you allow for someone else to speak. She glanced at me, hesitation written across her features. I've had relationships, ones that weren't safe, ones that made me doubt everything, even myself. Her words were careful, measured, but the tremor underneath revealed how close she was to collapse. I nodded slowly, letting her see that I understood the gravity without needing detail. No advice, no reassurances, not yet, just acknowledgement. I leaned back slightly, creating space while remaining present. Presence, I realized, could be stronger than any spoken comfort. It was an unshakable ground beneath someone unsure of their footing. Her gaze drifted away, following the rain streaking down the window, as if seeking answers outside instead of within. I don't trust easily, she admitted, voice dropping further. I push people away before they push me. I get scared of being left, of being misunderstood, of failing to measure up. Her confession was a delicate, fragile, and trembling, yet somehow raw and honest. I reached for my cup again, the clink against the saucer steadying, a rhythm she could anchor to if she chose. I didn't rush her. I didn't interject. The silence that followed was not empty. It was fertile, a place where trust could begin to root. I felt the responsibility, the subtle gravity of it, but it didn't intimidate me. I could hold that space. I could be the presence she needed without demanding it, without fear, without pressure. A few moments passed. She exhaled, long and slow, as if releasing a fragment of the weight she carried. Her shoulders sagged slightly, tension loosening. I met her eyes, steady, calm, silent, letting her know that she could stop holding herself so tightly around me. No judgment, no expectation. Just space, just constancy, just a choice offered freely, one moment at a time. And in that quiet acknowledgement, something subtle shifted. The weight didn't vanish, but it found a surface to rest on. A surface I didn't move from. For the first time, she didn't have to pretend to manage it alone. It started with nothing dramatic. No sudden confession. No grand declarations. Just the quiet rhythm of life intersecting with hers in ways that gradually mattered. I noticed her struggling with the door lock one evening as she fumbled with her keys, frustration tightening her shoulders. Without a word, I stepped closer, held the door steady, and turned the lock. She looked up at me, surprised, almost caught off guard by the simplicity of the... I didn't linger, didn't expect gratitude, but the faint relief on her face lingered with me far longer than I had anticipated. Later, I found her carrying too many bags from the market, her arms trembling under the weight of groceries she probably didn't want to ask anyone to help with. I offered my hand to one of the heavier bags. She hesitated, as though unused to the idea of assistance without obligation, and then, with a tentative smile, let me take it. Small moments, nothing cinematic, but every one of them laid a stone in the fragile bridge forming between us. I realized, too, that it wasn't just physical help she needed. The first time she spoke about her day in detail, I listened, truly listened, not waiting for a pause to insert my own experiences, not trying to fix anything, but simply letting her voice occupy the space, validating it by presence alone. She noticed, not in words, at first, but in the subtle softening of her expression, the way her shoulders lowered slightly when she thought I wasn't watching, the brief exhale of someone finally allowed to be fully present without judgment. We developed small routines, too. I would drop by with coffee when her mornings started too early, staying just long enough to share a quiet moment. No demands, no insistence. She began to leave small signs for me as well. A note tucked into a book I liked, a smile that lingered a fraction longer than necessary. The gestures weren't bold or calculated, were human, genuine, and entirely voluntary. She began speaking of things she had never voiced before. Old fears, quiet disappointments, the pressure to always appear strong. I held those words carefully, as though they were fragile objects that could shatter if mishandled. And I didn't offer solutions. I offered consistency. I didn't rush her into comfort. I provided a steady surface she could land on. One evening, as the sunset painted her kitchen in muted gold, she looked at me and said, almost shyly, "You always know when to show up." I merely nodded, letting the silence between us fill the space with understanding. No declaration, no drama, just the knowledge that being present, being steady, was enough to start rewriting the story she had carried for so long. In those small gestures, in the quiet constancy, I saw her begin to trust, not in a moment, but in the accumulation of moments that mattered, unspoken, yet undeniable. It was a quiet evening when she invited me over, not as a casual neighborly gesture, but deliberately, intentionally, as though she was testing whether I would accept. I noticed the hesitation in her voice, the way she paused before saying, "Would you like to come by for dinner?" The question wasn't loud, wasn't demanding. It was careful, fragile, carrying the weight of uncertainty and tentative trust. I nodded, simply, calmly, letting her know I would come without making a performance. The walk to her apartment felt like stepping into a space suspended in time. The city hummed outside, but between us, there was a quiet intensity, a gentle gravity that made everything feel more significant than it appeared. She had prepared something simple: pasta, sauce slightly too thick, bread that had been lightly toasted. Nothing extravagant, nothing meant to impress. But I could see the care in the way she arranged the plates, in the soft hesitations before she sat down. It was deliberate. She wanted to share this space with me, and that was an invitation I accepted with gratitude, not expectation. Conversation was tentative at first, measured. We spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the street noises, the books we were reading. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken exchange, a subtle acknowledgement of vulnerability. I noticed the fleeting glances, the slight relaxations in her posture when she realized I was listening without judgment, that my presence didn't demand performance perfection. After a while, the tension laughter emerged in small doses, gentle and unforced. A story about a clumsy neighbor, a recollection of a minor childhood embarrassment, nothing profound, yet somehow transformative. Every word she spoke, every pause she took, was a small act of choosing, and every gesture I made in response, silent or spoken, was my choice to honor that trust. At one point, she looked up at me, eyes bright with something like surprise, and said softly, "I don't usually do this. Invite someone over." I simply smiled, letting the weight of my gaze communicate steadiness. No promises, no grand declarations, just acknowledgement, presence, and the implicit understanding that she had been chosen and accepted. By the end of the evening, she moved more easily in her space, shoulders less tense, hands no longer tightly clasped. We cleaned up together, silently, rhythmically, without ceremony, and when I left, the air between us had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded words, but quietly, irrevocably. That night, trust began to root in a way that couldn't be undone by absence or hesitation. She had made the first choice. In turn, I had made mine. And in that mutual selection, something quietly significant began. The first time I noticed the details about her, I didn't make a point of it. I just observed, quietly, letting the small gestures of her life reveal themselves without comment or intrusion. She had habits that seemed insignificant at first. A tilt of the head when thinking, the way her eyes lingered on the light filtering through the blinds, the subtle tapping of her fingers against a book cover. But these small things, once noticed, painted a picture of a person careful with herself, protective of the space she allowed others to enter. She didn't know I noticed. That, I realized, was part of the trust being observation without interference, attention without judgment. I began to respond subtly, letting my actions accommodate her unspoken needs. If she reached for a chair and hesitated, I would move slightly to create room. If she spoke and faltered, I allowed silence to hold her words, waiting until she could find them fully. It wasn't a performance. It was attentiveness, a quiet respect that she hadn't expected and perhaps hadn't known she needed. One evening, she recounted an old memory, laughing softly yet cautiously, revealing a vulnerability she rarely shared. I didn't try to fill the silence or distract her with my own stories. I let her voice carry itself, small and uneven, like a fragile thread stretched carefully across a room. She noticed, eventually. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and the laughter that followed became easier, less guarded. I realized that trust often begins in unnoticed gestures. A hand placed casually on a doorknob, a smile that lingers just long enough, a nod that acknowledges presence without demanding response. Each time I responded to these small cues, her walls softened imperceptibly. There was no rush, no pressure, just a rhythm forming between us, steady and unforced. She began to let me see parts of her that were usually hidden, the worry lines on her forehead when thinking, the subtle bites of her lip when nervous, the way she sometimes stared out the window as if waiting for someone who would never come. I did not comment. I simply existed alongside her, a constant presence she could choose to rely upon. And then one afternoon, she paused mid-sentence, looking directly at me with a softness that had been absent before. "You see things," she whispered. It wasn't a question or accusation, only recognition. I nodded, quietly, understanding that this acknowledgement was more intimate than any words could convey. It was in these unnoticed details, in the careful attention to the smallest rhythms of her being, that the foundation of trust, fragile yet growing, took root. From that day, our shared silences carried meaning. It wasn't dramatic or overt, but every glance, every gesture, every measured pause became a testament to a bond neither of us had rushed into, yet both of us knew was beginning to matter. She withdrew first. I noticed it gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow shifting at the edge of a room. She spoke less, lingered in conversation shorter, and her smiles grew rarer, more measured. I understood why without needing her to explain. Fear was still very much a part of her life. Fear of attachment, fear of being hurt, fear of trusting someone enough to be left behind. She avoided certain topics, sidestepped small invitations, and sometimes, when I offered the simplest gestures, a cup of coffee, a message asking about her day, she hesitated before replying, weighing whether the momentary connection was worth the potential risk. I didn't push. I didn't plead. I simply remained steady, a constant presence that didn't demand more than she could give. One afternoon, she admitted it, almost reluctantly. In a whisper I had to lean in to hear. "I don't want to get close," she said, eyes fixed somewhere beyond me, distant. "I'm scared of being left." There was no dramatics, no accusation, just the quiet confession of someone used to carrying the weight of their fears alone. I didn't answer immediately. I just sat there, letting my stillness convey what words often failed to. My presence, calm and unwavering, offered her an unspoken assurance that she could choose to step closer or remain distant, and either choice would be met without judgment. I let her feel the steadiness I could provide, letting it seep into the spaces between her words. Over the next days, she tested boundaries in subtle ways. Small gestures, letting me help carry a bag, pausing to share a thought, sitting a little closer than before, revealed that her fear was still there, but it was no longer an absolute barrier. Each act, no matter how slight, was a choice, and I met each with patience and respect. Presence, consistency, and acknowledgement, a quiet language we shared. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the window, she spoke again. "I'm not used to not having to protect myself all the time," she murmured, voice tinged with vulnerability and relief. I nodded slowly, without interrupting. The silence that followed was not empty. It was an affirmation, a fragile yet growing acknowledgement that trust could exist, even in the presence of fear. Fear hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. Instead of being a wall, it was becoming a surface she could lean on without crumbling. I remained, a quiet counterweight to the uncertainty, allowing her to discover that closeness wasn't a risk to survive. It was something she could accept, one careful step at a time. And in that mutual navigation, subtle and deliberate, something significant began to root itself. The tentative, careful beginnings of belonging. The evening began quietly, the kind of calm that can deceive anyone who hasn't seen the storm inside her. I had stopped by her apartment after work, carrying nothing but a bottle of water and the faint awareness that she might need a steady presence more than conversation. When I arrived, the door was slightly ajar, a sign that she hadn't fully settled herself after whatever had unsettled her earlier. She was sitting on the edge of the sofa, hands pressed over her face, shoulders shaking with silent tremors. I didn't speak. I didn't ask questions. I simply sat beside her, leaving a space that invited her to lean in, but never imposing my proximity. The quiet between us was deliberate, not awkward. It was a container large enough for her emotions to exist without judgment. After what felt like an eternity, she exhaled sharply, letting her hands fall. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she murmured, almost inaudibly, I can't stop thinking about everything." I nodded gently, not interrupting, letting her know that it was okay to feel overwhelmed, and that she didn't have to manage it alone. I placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, enough to provide support, not pressure. No words, no promises, just presence. The tremor in her voice began to soften. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, and she shifted just enough to allow the quiet space between us to feel like a refuge. Sometimes, that was more important than any reassurance I could offer verbally. We stayed silent, the room filled only with the faint hum of the city outside, and the irregular tapping of rain against the window. She finally spoke again, voice almost a whisper. "With you, it feels different." There was no drama, no demand for explanation, just a recognition that she had found something she hadn't believed existed, a calm presence that could hold her storms without being swept away. Minutes stretched, a gentle rhythm forming between us. I didn't force comfort. I simply allowed her to feel safe, letting the weight she carried find a resting place. I realized then that trust wasn't built in grand gestures or declarations. It was cultivated in quiet attention, in the willingness to remain steady when someone else trembles. Eventually, she leaned slightly against me, not fully, not in a way that sought closeness forcibly, but in a tentative acknowledgement that it was okay to rely on someone else for a moment. I felt the subtle shift in her tension, a loosening that hadn't existed before. And in that small, unspoken act, I understood that what we were building, patiently, deliberately, was becoming something she could recognize, something she could allow herself to experience without fear. The storm outside persisted, but between us, there was a gentle calm. And in that calm, I knew we had taken a step together. One careful, steady step towards something neither of us had rushed into, yet both of us silently understood. Our routines had taken on a quiet rhythm. Mornings at the cafe, evenings with shared books or silent walks, messages sent simply to acknowledge presence rather than demand attention. It was a delicate balance, one built from unspoken understanding and the patience to allow trust to grow without force. Each gesture, each glance, each small act of acknowledgement carried weight, though it never needed to be named. One afternoon, we found ourselves walking through the narrow streets of the city, rain having softened into a gentle mist. She spoke little, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, her gaze occasionally drifting to the cobblestones beneath our feet. I walked beside her, keeping pace, allowing the silence to carry its own meaning. There was comfort in that quiet, a space where we didn't have to fill gaps with words, where presence alone was enough. She began sharing fragments of her thoughts, observations about the people passing, the way light reflected off wet pavement, the small details she usually kept to herself. I listened, responding only when necessary, letting my calm acknowledgement be the anchor to which she could tether her. Nothing was dramatic, nothing theatrical. It was a simple exchange of attention and recognition, but the effect was profound. Later, she paused at a bookstore window, staring at the display with a faint smile. "I used to come here sometimes," she murmured, voice soft, almost hesitant. "Never really bought anything, just looked. I liked imagining stories." I nodded, allowing the silence that followed to hold her memory without comment. Sometimes, the absence of words speaks more than the presence of them. We continued walking, and in that rhythm, I noticed the subtle shifts, the softening in her posture, the occasional glance toward me that lingered just a beat longer than before. Trust was no longer tentative, it was unfolding naturally, quietly, and with it came a sense of mutual acknowledgement that went beyond spoken promises. That evening, as we paused on a small bridge overlooking the river, she looked up at me and said, I feel like I can just be." There was no flourish, no dramatic confession, just recognition, a simple statement loaded with meaning. I didn't respond immediately. I let the weight of her words settle between us, allowing her the space to own them fully. In that quiet exchange, I realized that romance didn't always arrive with grand gestures or declarations. Sometimes it began in the accumulation of ordinary moments, small choices, and shared silence. Something had started here, subtle, deliberate, significant, something that neither of us had forced, yet both had chosen, moment by moment, without fanfare. And in that choice, the foundation of something enduring quietly took root, waiting to grow without urgency or expectation. The evening light spilled softly through the living room window, muted by the thin layer of clouds that lingered from the afternoon rain. We were sitting on the low couch, neither of us speaking, both content to let the silence carry its weight. I watched her hands rest lightly on her knees, fingers fidgeting only slightly, a quiet sign that tension still lingered beneath the surface, but not as sharply as before. She turned toward me slowly, eyes searching mine with a mixture of hesitation and something I could not yet name. "I've never felt safe with anyone," she whispered, almost afraid the words might vanish if spoken aloud. There was no theatricality, no cry for reassurance, just a fragile, honest confession that carried the entirety of her past fear. I met her gaze steadily, offering no forced comfort, no rehearsed phrase. Instead, I simply said, "Now you will feel safe." The words were quiet, calm, deliberate, meant not as a promise that erased the past, but as an acknowledgement of the choice we were making in that moment. She studied my face, as if testing the truth behind the statement, and then slowly exhaled, a hint of relief curling into her expression. We sat together, the room dimming as the sun sank low, the rhythm of our breathing synchronizing in a way that felt unspoken but natural. There was no need for grand gestures or declaration, no dramatic explanations of trust earned or love declared. What mattered was presence, the kind that requires nothing in return, that simply offers steadiness in the face of uncertainty. For the first time, I saw the faintest ease in her posture, the softening of shoulders that had long carried invisible weight, her hands unclenched slightly, resting more openly in her lap. She let herself lean, a small motion that said more than words ever could. She allowed the possibility of reliance, of connection, without fear that it would collapse. The world outside continued in its usual chaos. Cars passing, distant chatter, the occasional gust of wind. But here, within the quiet cocoon of our shared space, there was clarity. She could exist without constant vigilance. I could be present without expectation. That delicate balance, built over weeks of small gestures, silences, and careful observation, had formed something neither of us could have rushed into. She didn't speak again, only gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. And in that nod, in that stillness, I felt the weight of what had begun between us. Something steady, deliberate, fragile, yet unbreakable, growing quietly in the spaces where trust had finally taken root. The air between us carried a promise, not of certainty, but of presence. A calm certainty that she was chosen, acknowledged, and safe, if only for now, and that we would continue building this, moment by moment, together.